This week, to be closer to China, in the trade war, the U.S. and China, both sides seem to be digging in for a long battle. Protracted conflict harms both economies, reduces standards of living, undermines the world economy. Is compromise becoming more difficult? How to break the cycle, reverse the negative trend? The U.S. demands are well known, but what does China want? Who is really paying the tariffs? What about U.S. sanctions on Huawei? Can China and the U.S. restore trust? What confidence-building steps can be taken? This week, be closer to China. In the trade war, China and the United States, both sides, by their rhetoric and by their actions, seem to be digging in for a long battle. Protracted conflict harms both economies, reduces standards of living, undermines the world economy. Everyone suffers. What's worse is talk of decoupling the Chinese and American economies. Decoupling would be an economic disaster, damaging each country and the entire world, perhaps irreversibly. Moreover, the danger of decoupling goes beyond economics, allowing the two largest economies to edge toward a new, real Cold War with unpredictable consequences. If attitudes are hardening, is compromise becoming more difficult? How to break the cycle, reverse the negative trend? We ask key questions. The U.S. demands are well known, but what does China want? To make a deal, both sides must agree. How are tariffs actually working? Who is paying the bills? Is decoupling a real possibility? How do U.S. sanctions on Huawei affect relations? Most important, how to restore trust in Sino-U.S. relations, what confidence-building steps can be taken, however small. China says it follows the rules. The U.S. says China breaks the rules. I have an idea to reconcile China and the U.S. thinking about rules. I'll try out my idea on our guest experts. I hope it can bring us closer to China. The Avang Farm in Woodstock, Illinois, has developed a number of revenue streams over the years, from dairy production to corn. Their focus right now is on planting soybeans following months of wet weather. But the key concern for Michelle Avang remains the trade dispute between China and the U.S.
We really need a win in agriculture. This has just been going on for too long. We need to have some kind of resolution with China. That's the most important thing right now to most farmers.
Following months of China-U.S. talks, the two sides appeared to be getting close to a deal. But earlier in May, ahead of the latest round of talks, hopes were dashed as U.S. President Donald Trump went ahead with long-delayed plans to raise tariffs on $200 billion of goods imported from China from 10% to 25%. China responded by targeting $60 billion of U.S. goods for added duties.
I've been a skeptic of getting to an agreement from the start because essentially what I think we have is two countries that both think they have the strong hand in the negotiation.
It could be a devastating blow for many U.S. farmers.
It sounds like this could go on for years. And, you know, we can't deal with that out here in the countryside. We're in our 6th straight year of declining farm income, and there's just not a lot of good news in sight.
This field will soon be full of soybeans. Still uncertain is whether there will be a market for them to be sold at harvest time. Amidst the tariff hikes and concerns over the current stalemate, there is a larger question looming. Are China and the U.S. heading for a divorce, with growing calls on the U.S. side for complete decoupling of their economies? An article in the Washington Post highlighted the problem. The United States for years relied on economic interdependence with China as a stabilizing force in relations with Beijing, with business between the two nations forming what former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson used to call the ballast in U.S. China affairs. To discuss the state of Sino-U.S. affairs, we have in Beijing Dr. Renzong Zhe, Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. His research areas include U.S. foreign policy, China foreign policy, and international security and development. And Professor Zhang Jianping, Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation at the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. His research areas include international economy and China's overseas investment. Gentlemen, welcome. Let's start with the current status. Where are we now? And frankly, you know, we all know what the U.S. is asking for. I'm not sure I can get all of them in one second, but trade deficit, intellectual property rights, cyber theft, joint venture technology transfer, currency issues, a whole bunch of things. But nobody ever talks about what China wants. I mean, when you have an agreement, both sides have to get what they want and compromise and make it happen. So, Dr. Yuan, what does China want?
Well, absolutely. China really wants the agreement must be a balanced one. And the key point, two things. The first one, the tariffs has been added since last year to the Chinese products. It should be removed. Not by impartial, but to all of them should be removed. Because from this part of the trade negotiation, one of the trigger is the U.S. side to put the tariffs on the Chinese products. So it will be far better if the tariffs are removed. That will create the better conditionality for both sides. This is number one. Then number two, any kind of agreement or a deal should be balanced. There should not be just a one-way traffic. That is to say, U.S. has made a very strong argument for what U.S. wants. In the same time, U.S. should also listen to what Chinese wants. Particularly, I think this time, because of the setback of the trade talk, one of the main reasons is U.S. does not listen or consider China's legitimate demands for what it really intended to do. So this agreement must be a kind of reasonable, based on mutual beneficial and on equal footing.
And that certainly sounds reasonable. What are some of the, in addition to removing the tariffs, what are some other of Chinese interests in terms of the nature of the agreement?
Yeah, the other thing I should also add is, you know, the U.S. demands China's purchase much more in order to narrow the gap of the so-called imbalance or balance. But the point that China like to make is, you got give me some more to choose from. Now, the number one and number two products that U.S. offer to China is the airplane and the soybeans, or plus energy products. We want more. So the point is there is a structural problem. U.S. has imposed the export control on many of the products for China. So I think it will be good and reasonable for the U.S. side to take some step to do some review the export control. Because they started this export control because they say, well, there are high-tech products.
Dual use.
Dual use whatsoever. However, I think there's a reason for that. 20 years ago or nearly 30 years ago when this sanction has been put on China. Now it is no longer that high-tech anymore because the technology progress on daily basis pretty fast. Secondly, in order to address the concern of dual use, China agree with the United States. We can make a compromise. For example, you can have established a monitoring system to monitor the end users, right? So that will be a very effective instrument to make sure that those even dual-use technology products should not be used for military purpose.
And there's a word that's being used in the United States called decoupling. Decoupling the U.S. economy from the Chinese economy. There are a few people who are advocating that. The vast majority of American economists, even policymakers, think that's terrible. But there are some who think that's a good idea. And I want to explore what that would mean. Decoupling means really to eliminate the production and the production chains and the distribution chains that have fueled the globalization and have really driven down prices and lifted standards of living.
Yeah.
So what are the implications if you have a real economic decoupling?
Yeah.
Professor?
I think this is a very dangerous idea. Also, that's a typical, anti-globalization process. Actually, today, we have so advanced technology, and meanwhile, we have so advanced, transportation tools, communication tools, and globalization, that will be the trend. Also, in the past 4 decades, China's economy deeply involved in a global economy. Between China and the U.S., we already created so complicated, global supply chain cooperation relationship. Also, if you look at economies between two countries, actually, every year, China, we have our advantages on trading goods. We provided so lot of, qualified goods to U.S. people. Meanwhile, Chinese side, when they get money, they also need to buy, U.S. governmental debt. And actually, there is a very huge, economic circle. And the two countries seriously rely on each other. In the future, if you want to destroy this type of relationship, that means you will create economic disaster.
What people don't realize is the huge amount of time that it takes to build it and then to rebuild it if there's a break. It's very easy to put on some tariff to force people to change. But once you make that change, you can't, and then you say, okay, we have an agreement, now let's go back and play nice the way we were. You can't do it. I mean, it would take years, if not a decade or more, to rebuild what you have destroyed.
Absolutely.
So people have to recognize that the decisions that they may be making or putting policies in place that will force businesses who have fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders to make decisions based on policy, but once they make those decisions, it's very hard to go back.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Ron?
Well, absolutely. In the last 40 years, we tried so hard to build up the relationship, to build up the trust. However, if you want to destroy it, those trust, it can happen very quickly. But if you want to regain, it will be enormous difficulties, and it will take tremendous efforts to do that. So the narratives about decoupling is quite misleading. China is a huge market. I can't think anyone else like to miss this opportunity. At this moment, there are 400 million middle-income population in China. This population grows very fast. It will be the #1 market. One thing is a problem today about the world economy, because it's a lack of very sufficient demand. That is to say, you need a market. However, China is a huge market out there. China like to share this market to the rest of the world, including the United States. For example, very recently, you have seen the Chinese government leadership that made so many promises, commitment to further open up China's market.
Financial markets, auto markets.
Or service markets or whatever. And early this year, Chinese government decided to introduce the foreign investment law. And that will treat the foreign investors to domestic investors equally. So all these efforts will make China's market more attractive and more significant. Let's say if the U.S. or somebody wants to get away with this market, I don't think that is a reasonable, smart choice for that. The point is they should do everything possible to stay and penetrate even further to this market. Then this is the area we should work together.
2019 marks the 40th anniversary of the establishment of China-U.S. diplomatic relations. It has never been a smooth ride. Recent trade tensions have brought its share of bumps. Hopes of reaching a deal were dashed, followed by stiff tariff hikes, Huawei sanctions, stock market plunge, consumer suffering, and world worrying. President Trump tweeted on May 13th, "There will be nobody left in China to do business with. Very bad for China, very good for USA. But China has taken so advantage of the U.S. for so many years that they are way ahead." But is that true? Jeffrey Sachs, professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, wrote a CNN essay titled, "China is not the source of our economic problems. Corporate greed is." He said, "China has been playing by Western rules for the past 40 years, gradually catching up the way America's Asian allies did in the past. Trade with China provides the United States with low-cost consumer goods and increasingly high-quality products. It also causes job losses in sectors such as manufacturing that compete directly with China. That is how trade works," wrote Sachs. Okay, let's talk about the historical perspective. How did we get where we are? Dr. Wu, could you kind of rehearse the history of the last 40 years of China-U.S. relations with particular emphasis on where we are today?
Well, absolutely. You know, this year marks the 40th anniversary of China-U.S. diplomatic relationship. In the last 40 years, offer us a lot of experience and lessons we could draw from, and in order to help us to shape the future. I think we can divide it into three periods. The first period during the Cold War, when China and the U.S. get together, the driver of this relationship is because both China and the United States, we confront a common enemy at that time. So that becomes the driving force. Then the second period and the demise of the Cold War, China and the U.S., we have an opportunity to work on common prosperity. So because there's no imminent threat to our security, both sides have the opportunity to work on the economic issues, improve in people's life and well-being. Now, I think we are entering the third period of this relationship. The driving force turned out to be the common responsibility. Because China and the United States are the largest two economies in the world, we shoulder very special responsibility for world peace and prosperity. It would be inconceivable to think about China and the U.S. fight with each other. Today, of course, we are in the trade war, and that already generates lots of repercussions, lots of backlash, not only in both sides, but also for the rest of the world. You know, some people come up to China and come up to the United States to say that you two elephants are fighting each other. The grass will suffer. So please spare us. This is the calling from the international community. That should be the responsibility. China and the United States should work together to provide the public goods, peace and prosperity, not just for us, for the rest of the world. So this relationship, to put it simply, was involved from working on to fight the common enemy, then to have that peace dividend, to work on the prosperity. Now the third part is we should shoulder the common responsibility for the future.
Let's take that big vision and find out how we get there from where we are today. And so I want to start with some small steps. I want to look toward resolution. Where do we go from here? So I want to ask this question to both of you, starting with Professor Zhang. What are some confidence-building steps, even if they're small steps? What can each side do to show respect, to show some confidence, to show trust, without denying their core interests and core things? What confidence-building steps can be taken?
Yeah, I think it's very important for both our two sides can keep very, rational attitude to consider, bilateral relationship. Today, U.S. side just blame on very huge trade deficit, but from Chinese side, we also provided a very important data. That is, U.S. business circle every year can take profit from China's market, higher than Chinese side from the U.S. market, estimated about 20 billion US dollars to 30 billion US dollars. Actually, U.S. side is definitely benefit from China-U.S. economic relationship and partnership. But on the contrary, U.S. side still blame on Chinese side unfair trade. So this type of things, I think that we need to have, to keep objective attitude and rational attitude to consider different, problems. Especially, my observation is that today, from the U.S. side, just use one type of tool, tariff. But U.S. side trying to achieve many targets, just like you mentioned, trade imbalance, IPR issues, technology transfer issues, SOE issues, as well as many others.
Market access.
Yeah, market access in very short term, very quite limited time. So my sense is that it's too if you want to solve a lot of problems within short term, that would be impractical.
What are some minimum steps that each side can do, or what are the minimum requirements that each side needs in order to have a deal?
My advice is listening. We need to listen to each other carefully, patiently, respectfully. Listen is very important at this moment, because the trade war, against the backdrop of this escalation trade war issue, first of all, we should take some pressure off to be sober-minded, to listen to each other. At this moment, for example, my understanding, China has listened to the U.S. side very carefully what the U.S. demands. Their list, their laundry list is pretty long. It's getting longer and longer. And so we all know about this. But China should also listen. Why is that? Listen to Americans' perspective on that and their views on how to address it. And equally important, I think U.S. should also listen to what China's demands. I think this is something the U.S. side can do. And why China think this way? Why China thinks the tariff is a very important obstacle to remove first, then pave way for others? We have 2 ears, 1 mouth. So we should use the ears to listen more to the other side, to show the respect. This is a minimal step. But now at this moment, it's the atmosphere is deteriorating, getting pretty lasting. So it is extremely important at this moment for both China and the United States sit down and listen to each other to figure out what are we going to do together, how shall we to make our effort to meet in the middle.
Let's do it again. Let's follow the story. We hope let's have the best hopes and continue to work together. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
Culture Express. See the world in color. From emerging powers to expanding partnerships, from fighting poverty to combating climate change, booming economies, war-ravaged nations, and everything in between. We capture the changes affecting the most dynamic and diverse continent on the planet, taking you beyond the headlines to the people and their stories. Asia Today, delivering Asia to the world.
Almost all economists assert that tariffs are wrong-headed. that tariffs erode economic efficiency. According to the IMF, consumers are the losers. Tariffs have been borne almost entirely by U.S. importers who pass on some of the extra costs to consumers, like the tariffs on washing machines. China and the U.S. agree on who started the tariff war, the U.S. obviously, but disagree on why. China says the U.S. seeks to contain China, thwart China's rise. The U.S. says it seeks to even what has been an uneven playing field. For months, the leading negotiators on both sides were issuing optimistic updates. But then the impasse. The U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Steven Mnuchin, asserted that the talks went substantially backward. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang stated that working out disagreements over trade was a process of negotiation and that China was not avoiding problems. Xinhua was blunt. The U.S. government presented a number of arrogant demands to China, including restricting the development of state-owned enterprises. This shows that behind the U.S. trade war against China, it is trying to invade China's economic sovereignty and force China to damage its core interests. China's top trade negotiator, Vice Premier Liu He, provided calm assessment. We have a consensus in lots of areas, but to speak frankly, the areas we have differences concern big principles. All punitive tariffs must be canceled. Purchases of U.S. goods must be rational, and the text of the agreement must be balanced and dignified. Here's my idea. When China joined the WTO in 2001, as a developing country, it was allowed different rules, such as tariffs to protect domestic industries. Now, almost 2 decades later, as China has developed so dramatically, the original rules are no longer as appropriate. So, how about this? An oversimplification, but let me try it. The U.S. might appreciate that China has been largely following the rules, and China might appreciate that some of those rules should now change, which China is in fact already doing, such as IPR courts, a new foreign investment law that treats foreign and domestic companies equally, and opening of markets such as in financial services and automobiles. I like Dr. Wang Zhongzu's advice. The two sides should listen to each other. Listening is that small step to be closer to China.